I feel a little bit awkward starting this because all of the conversations earlier, everyone kept pointing at me going, Ray, Ray, you know, the Microsoft person in the room. It's really awkward sometimes being the Microsoft person in the room because we do so many different things. You know, we're 250,000 people, and people come up to me at parties and go, can you help me with my Xbox? Can you tell me how to get past this bit on a game? Or, you know, Outlook or whatever it might be. It's really challenging. I've learned to go, I don't know the answer, but I know some people who might. It's a bit like if you're in engineering and somebody comes to you and says, I've got this really difficult problem that my son is dealing with in law, in privacy legislation. You must be able to help with that. It's that kind of scenario. Look, I'm going to try and do some things that I've never done before. Because I came along thinking what I want to do is project wirelessly from my Surface. But the wireless projector won't plug in to your beautifully specified AV equipment. So what I've done is I'm projecting from my laptop that's connected there, and then I'm hopefully going to control it from my Surface. If that doesn't work, then we're going to try another journey to get through this. But we're going to try it and see. And just in the world of trying things I've never tried before, I want to ask you if you found some of the things in Office that you haven't tried before that might be useful. So here's my favorite one of the moment is, you know, when you move around on PowerPoint, you get all these little things down here to go left and right and annotate or whatever. Has anybody seen this one? This little icon down here. So if you're on the Insider version or any of the Office preview versions, you'll see that. And if I click it, what it does is start the subtitling system. So now what it is doing is listening to me talking through the microphone in my PC, sending the speech off to the speech-to-text service in Azure, and adding subtitles at the bottom of the slide. So if you haven't got that in your version, then it's coming. If you have, give it a whirl. Now, it's not set up for a remote microphone the way this is set up, so I can't stand over here and talk to you and have it do the transcription. But if you imagine if you had a little remote mic, like those audio systems that lots of lecture halls are set up with, being able to feed that into your PC, and your international students being able to see subtitles at the same time as speaking. There is a version of it that's built into PowerPoint natively. There's also a version of it called Presentation Translator that's an add-in that also adds the ability to translate so that then you could see the subtitles in Chinese, for example. Or you can see the subtitles in English and provide students with a QR code where they can choose the language of the subtitles that they see on their phone. So I can be speaking in English, the subtitles can be in English. Everybody in this room could have a different language version appearing on their phone in real time in front of them as well in 72 different languages. So one of the challenges is how do we keep up to speed with all this stuff? I have to say the only answer is to keep playing, keep experimenting, see something go, I wonder what that does. I've learned that I can't break it now by clicking on things. But there's all this kind of stuff that's just coming along and nobody's going to come out and tell you about it. You're either going to read about it or a colleague is going to show it to you. So there's my contribution. Before I start talking today, there's the little thing that you might find useful. Okay, we're going to talk about, well, in fact, we've been talking for the last 2 days about digital disruption, haven't we? I want to talk about the concept of how we become owners of the disruption. Because I think there's a bit of an issue that sometimes we feel like we're being hit by a tsunami of change, and especially of technology change. And let me be completely open and honest with you. The first thing I do every morning is I open an application to see what news has been published about Microsoft. Because I want to know, before you ask me a question about it, what we announced overnight. So just because you're in the inner sanctum doesn't mean necessarily that you're able to keep up with everything. I cannot possibly keep up with what is called the fire hose, which is the amount of information that is published just about our own organization. And so you're not going to be able to either, because we've all got our jobs to do, as well as keeping up to date with everything. So it's a big challenge of how do we keep up with this digital disruption? Because at the same time, everyone is telling us the robots are coming. And they're going to destroy our jobs and our careers and our futures. And they're certainly going to destroy the jobs and careers and futures for the students that are going through as well. And it all comes in this context of the 4 industrial revolutions. And so the 4th industrial revolution, which apparently started in 2014, when the World Economic Forum noticed that it was happening, is this last phase about the blurring of the physical and the digital divide. Easiest way to see that is on your way to work in the morning, look at somebody on the street. They're in a physical place, and most of them are in a digital place as well, aren't they? And this blurring of the physical and the digital divide is what's causing the 4th industrial revolution. And so as a result, the robots are coming to take our jobs. The good news is we've been through this before, and it's happened just as fast before. This is 1905. This is the Flatiron building in New York. And at this stage in 1905, 10% of the food production in the US, 10% of the workforce in New York was simply about looking after horses. 25% of the food production in the whole of the country was devoted to feeding the horses. And somebody said, let's invent a car. And in 10 years, it went from that to this, where there's no horses. We're in a completely motorized world. And the worry for people was, but our jobs are going to disappear. My job of leading a horse, my job of feeding and grooming and growing the food for them disappears. But of course, what happened? A whole new range of jobs were created. And that happened in just 20 years. That complete change in the whole economy happened in just 20 years. And that's the kind of feeling I get of what we're going through at the moment when people come back to write the history books, because we're seeing stuff like this. Half the jobs are going to disappear by 2034. Well, this was written in 2014. It was 20 years away. Now it's 15 years away. And it's starting to look a little bit scarily true. But what this doesn't do is to say what is being created as these jobs are being automated. Sure, some jobs will disappear, but some new ones will appear. So yeah, robots are coming to destroy our jobs, but it's creating a whole new economy for us. Here's the kind of classic robots are coming to destroy our jobs, the Nightscope security robot that wanders around shopping malls looking for trouble. And when it spots trouble, it does something that robots are supposed to do, which is look suspicious. Now, this is the classic vision of robots coming to destroy our jobs. They do one job, and they do it well. But ask him to do a second job, like cope with the staircase, and it does it really badly. This is the hope that keeps me alive, is seeing things like this. But then on the other hand, we've got really deep stuff going on with robotics. So I don't know if anybody's seen this. This is Boston Dynamics. Yeah, I could do all of that. I probably couldn't do that. Bit of training involved to get me to do that. I'm too old for that. And the way at the end, it kind of goes from being a robot to being a robot that self-congratulates. It's a little bit scary. So the world is changing fast. And I think everything I heard this morning was an indicator of how fast the world is changing. Because even the answers to the questions about, well, how long did that take you, is incredibly short time when you think about the millennia that universities have been around. The good news is we've got some data that tells us how the world is changing. So this is data from the ABS, which means it's already out of date. You know that, don't you? If you wait for this data, then it's out of date. But up here, you've got the big growth careers. So aged and disabled carers, registered nurses, child carers, waiters, sorry. I can't fix my eyesight with the small screen. But what is really fascinating is when you look at that stuff, look where the growth is. The growth is in traditionally low-wage, unskilled jobs, or at least low-wage jobs. Except that we've got in here software developers, policy analysts, look what's happening down here. A whole load of jobs that are completely disappearing. But what I would posit is actually when you think about those jobs over on the right-hand side, those are becoming technologically advanced just as much as any other. So take nursing, which is one of those extreme right. Lots of new nursing positions being created over the next 5 to 10 years in Australia. And this is a traditional scenario where I think this is the assessor rather than the student. Hopefully it's the assessor because they're not looking at the patient. But the kind of task that you might do as an assessment activity is, have somebody talking to an actor that's a patient, simulating a set of conditions that then the nurse is being evaluated on. The way that's being done now is with this. So we've set up 3D holographic studios around the world in order to be able to film and turn into a real hologram an individual. And that person looks like they're there. And they look like they were there in that picture. I don't know if anybody spotted that you could just about see through the top of their head and see the back of the chair, which isn't normal. But to the nurse that's wearing that headset, that person is there and real. I've seen this happen. Somebody has walked into my lounge when I've had a holographic headset on and sat on my sofa, but it was a hologram. You become completely immersed in it. So it's not just the technology jobs that are being disrupted by technology. It's virtually every job in the future. And so how do you cope with it? How do you cope with the scale of transformation that we're having? And especially how do you cope with the fact that this transformation is about a digital thing, which has traditionally been a silo somewhere else. It's been somebody else's problem, but now it's everybody's problem. Well, we've kind of made the transformation, I think, in our consumer lives. We've had to look at it from a organizational viewpoint. So I said earlier, about 250,000 people in or very closely associated with Microsoft. We've had to go through a massive journey of transformation for those 250,000 people. And there are 3 lessons from our transformation. The first is we've had to change ourselves from being a know-it-all organization to be a learn-it-all organization. It's no mistake that our facilities around the world are called campuses because we've had a lot of know-it-alls on our campus. They knew the way things should happen. And they tried other things before and they hadn't worked and they weren't prepared to try them again. And we'd even got into this culture of not allowing for failure, which is really odd because if I think about all the things that I've learned as deep lessons throughout my life, it's been learning through failure rather than success. Because success you take for granted, whereas failure lets you look deep into yourself and say, what did I do wrong? And so we had to transform that as an organization to say, well, we're not failing enough, because if we're not experimenting, we're not failing. If we're only doing the things that we know to be successful, then we're not going to be able to innovate. So the first lesson was changing our mindset to become people, an organization that was continually learning. And the second was accepting failure. And then the third is how do we move our mindset to be an agile organization? Because in this fast changing world, being anything but agile leaves us at risk. And I see parallels, what we've done to what I see in the university sector. So, this example is at RMIT. Anybody here from RMIT? No, so they're doing some great work in architecture and urban design. So these students are wearing holographic headsets. And what they're doing is constructing in 3 dimensions. And the reason that they have to do that is that the current way of building a 3D building is to design it in 3 dimensions and then turn it into a series of flat plans so that the builders can put it together to result in a 3D design. So the limitation is, can you take a 3D design and put it into 2D? Because if you can't hand the plans over. So what they're now doing is working on how they build in 3 dimensions. So they never go back to 2 dimensions. They start with a 3D plan and then construct in 3 dimensions. So in their scenarios, they've got brickies wearing these headsets, putting bricks where the headset says it should be, rather than looking at plans. It allows them to keep the productivity of a brickie at the same for a complex 3D design as it would be for a normal build a straight wall. When brickies laid the UTS building, the Frank Gehry building, which looks like the crumpled paper bag, they went from typically 600 bricks a day to about 80. So their productivity fell 90% because they had every single brick was in a different orientation. But the problem is the practice doesn't exist about how you do this. So they are having to turn these students into researchers. The students aren't receiving a course where everything is done. They are acting as researchers in order to work out what best industry practice looks like, because by the time they get to industry, they'll be doing this stuff. And they are teaching commercial organizations how to do this. So those students are teaching Lend-Lease how to truly construct three-dimensional buildings. And if you can imagine some of the things we've talked about, systems and processes today, being able to do that is a big cultural transformation within the organization. So we've had to go through three things: changing our culture, changing our decision making. We've also had to go through a process of changing our products. And again, there's a parallel to universities. So you've had a day and a half of sitting and listening and asking questions at the end. So I'd like to turn it around a little bit, because I've got 4 subjects here and I've got no idea which one you might be interested in. We've probably got time to cover 2 of these subjects during the course of the next half an hour or so. So anybody want to make a choice, or would you like to vote by a show of hands?
Oh, we have our pieces of paper on the desk.
Awesome. Okay, how many colours have we got?
We have green, red and
Yellow. Okay, so let's take, if you want to know about the journey of becoming learn-it-alls, then let's go with green. If you want to know the journey about becoming a data decision-making organization, let's go with red. So green, red, orange, and just your hand with no piece of paper in it. Green for learn-it-all, red for data-driven decision-making, orange for the issue of 2/3 of what our students are learning is out of date by the time they graduate, and then just your hand for the bottom right. You're not allowed to hold up 2. Okay, it looks like we're on red. Okay, can anybody remember which one was the red one? Okay. So, data-driven decision-making. We've got time for 2, hopefully. Okay, so one of the things we've had to do as an organization is go through a process of actually making decisions with data. My favorite saying is, the plural of anecdote is not anecdata. But we were really good at making decisions with anecdotes. So what you did was find the leader that was going into the decision-making meeting and talk to them on the way to the meeting about what your son had just experienced somewhere, or a bug that you found in a piece of software, or the most annoying thing about email is, because that was the anecdote they would walk into the meeting for, and you get your own way. We've had to change that and become a decision-making organization that uses data to make our decisions. Now, my view is every business is becoming a data-led, data decision-making organization. And my example is Rolls-Royce. Rolls-Royce make the engines slung under the wings of most of the planes that we fly on. And Rolls-Royce's business used to be selling jet engines. But now Rolls-Royce's business is optimizing the data, because what they sell you is flying hours. You don't no longer buy a jet engine. What you do is buy flying hours. And so one of the challenges for Rolls-Royce is they make no money when their planes are on the ground. So they're all in favor of these fast turnarounds of planes, but they also are trying to optimize the way that they can deliver their service to optimize the revenue they get from planes being in the air. And so they've had to do a whole heap of things. They look at the fuel consumption of their engines they take the data from that and say, what can we do to optimize the next flight? The next 10 flights, the next 100 flights, because the biggest cost for airlines is actually fuel. So if they can save their customers money, they can spend more money on getting their planes in the air. They also look at all the maintenance. And what they're trying to do is optimize the maintenance, because there are two things. One is, if you wait until the last minute to do a piece of scheduled maintenance, you don't have much control over how it's done. Whereas if you can schedule it earlier, then you can do it in a convenient place. But the second thing is, if you've got to deal with a failure, that failure could be anywhere in the world. Whereas if you can anticipate a failure and do the repair where it's convenient before an item has failed, you become a much more efficient engine operator. And so they've looked at their whole business and said, how do we get our engines to produce the data that we need in order to become a more efficient organization? They're a data-driven business, and their business now is in consuming that data to turn around the flying hours. I heard last week, the Dreamliner, when it lands in London after it's flown from Perth, downloads 1 terabyte of data from one flight on one plane. Imagine how much data is being sucked out and used. So their business is now to be a data business. And so one of the things Satya said when he took over Microsoft 5 years ago was, we need to be in the same position. We need to be a data-led decision-making organization. His first internal communication was about using data to make decisions. What is really nice is that MIT have been doing some research with a number of organizations around the world, and that involved them coming in and looking really closely inside Microsoft and saying, what are the attributes of good data-led decision-making organizations? This slide illustrates a couple of them. They're quite easy. The first is you have to have lots of people involved. So you have cross-functional groups. It's no longer the job of the BI team or whatever. So we have a great project that involves our data team, our IT team, and our facilities team to look at how we optimize our facilities use. And it's that multifunctional team that are all aligned together to solve the business problem that has given the breakthrough, and that MIT identified as one of the 5 characteristics of an organization that does it well. The second thing is we had to slaughter the thing in the top left-hand corner of this graphic. Does anybody know what this is? It's a hippo. Does anybody know what a hippo is? I'm sure you don't have any hippos in your organization, but we have in ours. The hippo is the highest paid person's opinion. And we had to slaughter our hippos because we were making decisions based on our hippos. Which is crazy because we've got 10 billion people using our products. So we know so much about how they use it, and we have so much data. But instead, somebody would come into a meeting and go, well, I think this. So we had to slaughter our hippos. That was a second key thing that MIT research found. So that addresses the top 2. The other things, interestingly, were around the cultural change. So getting data to the right people. We had to accept a culture which is our data is open and shared within the organization, unless it can't be. But making the data available to people to make their own decisions. Creating an A-team, so getting a team of people that could go in and help people as they were in that journey of changing to decision-making. And that was about the processes of changing decision-making, but it was also about the process of using and publishing data. And then sharing best practices. You'll all have seen or been featured in a Microsoft case study. We've done a lot of that internally as well. So this team is using this, and we promote that internally as a case study to encourage other teams to go and do it. And for us, those are the 5 things that have led us towards being able to have a culture that is about using data, learning from data, and making decisions based on data. I won't say that 100% of our decisions are based on data, but are way, way more than ever have been before. And if you think about some of the stories you've been hearing today, think about the data stream that's coming off those things and how you might use those data streams in order to be able to turn it into, as it says here, data fuel. Data is the fuel that drives that decision making. This is big data in 1939. London Underground sorting the tickets, used to stamp in and stamp out, so they would then assemble them all into piles about which station you arrived and which station you left. It was their way of mapping transport use. This is data-led decision-making in 2015.
Well, we just built a system to
That's year 10 kids at Seymour College in South Australia. We just built a system to predict breast cancer. What's going to happen when those students arrive with you? What's their expectation? What are their skills levels? You know, and these students are now in a university somewhere in South Australia. It's really interesting. The old world of big data being restricted to data scientists, that's gone. Because now data is the thing that fuels business. So everybody needs to be able to understand it. I have actually gone through the exercise and taken the same class that they have in order to be able to do it. It's astounding what students are up to. An example of data-led decision-making, everyone's on the race for going up the ranking tables, whether it's the THE ranking tables or the QSR ranking tables or the Leiden Index, or preferably all 27 of them at the same time. And this story on the left-hand side from the Wall Street Journal and Times Higher said, the higher up the ranking tables you go, the faster your growth. Which I thought was quite interesting, because I don't actually believe it's true, because I don't think that chart genuinely shows that, because the top tier, the blue ones, appear to be the slowest growing. So maybe they need some help with their data-led decision-making. But it kind of was fascinating to me, because I looked at it and I thought, that's interesting, I wonder what it says for Australia. And I've got a data set on Australian universities that allowed me to do that in about 2 minutes. And so the answer for Australia is the higher up the ranking tables, the slower your student growth. Now, that would be an interesting data-led decision-making conversation within an organization, because people chase the rankings. So that culture of understanding and using data and then making decisions based on it is a long journey. In our case, 4.5 to 5 years in some parts of our business. In other parts, we've not yet got there. But the reason that we're doing it is because the data is available, and the tools to be able to use that data are now so much easier to use and more useful across the organization. And I think of all the organizations that I talk to my colleagues about, probably universities are the most data rich. If you went to students and said, tell me about organizations that really know you, they're probably going to list Iconic. They're probably going to list some of the social networks they use. And yet they have more interactions and more data points generated in their interactions with the university than with any of those organizations. Okay, where do we go next? Should we go with green? Because, yeah.
Yes.
Just so I don't get lynched by the non. Okay, so let's talk about learning it all. This feels a little bit weird as somebody from a commercial organization, albeit the world's most valuable commercial organization, talking to you about becoming a learn-it-all. But I'm going to take that risk because we've gone through a journey, but also because it's a conversation that I have every week with a vice chancellor or a deputy vice chancellor, because it's top of mind for them as well. So our agenda was about digital transformation. So the world's biggest technology company, we chose to change because we felt we needed to undergo a digital transformation, which is really fascinating, because you'd kind of assume that we'd do that stuff already, but we don't. I just did some certification on Excel, and I learned new things about Excel, despite the fact I've been using it for 35 years. But our journey was around how do we make that digital transformation. And so we had to drop one set of behaviors and learn a new set. We had to go from this know-it-all to the learn-it-all organization. We had to go from being critical of what people wanted to being supportive of change. If somebody had an idea, it's like, well, that's interesting. One of the phrases we had to learn was and, not but. When somebody comes up with a bonkers idea, you go, that's really interesting, and if we did this with it, we could go somewhere else. As opposed to, I think that's an interesting idea, but it's never going to work. We had to go from fear to bravery. So we had to go from this culture of fear to a culture of bravery. That as long as the value of the lesson you learned from making a mistake is more than what it cost you, great. We had to go from insular to external. We talk about eyes outside the boat. I've got a set of playing cards that have all the data, the top 6 items of data for all of the universities in Australia. And I play the card game with senior leadership teams in universities, and people go, how do you know this stuff about us? I said, well, it's all out on the web. Because people are looking at their own internal perspective rather than the external perspective. And it's really interesting when you start to think externally and reflect. Going from the hero to the team, we celebrated heroes. Now we actually say in our annual review process, what have you done to contribute to the work of others? And what have others done to contribute to the work of you? And going from individual organizational silos into a single organization. So that's our journey from know-it-all to learn-it-all. Big part of it has been about the work of Carol Dweck and growth mindset. It's such a big part of it that I came across a colleague who went to their local primary school, and the local primary school was teaching about growth mindset, of course, because that's where it all started. And they said, you won't believe this, they've stolen our growth mindset stuff. So we had to do a little bit of teaching, but kind of going into that mindset change. And then I think about the journey we've been on, and then I look at what's being published at the moment. So here's something really scary. So this report from Alpha Beta, which was sponsored by Google, looks at the future of learning in Australia. And so it says that the number of learning hours is going to double from 300 billion hours to 600 billion hours by 2040. And 95% of that growth is going to be beyond the age of 21. So right in your wheelhouse. And they've gone into it and said, well, where's it going to happen? How's it going to happen? I want you to look at this chart. So on the left-hand side is today. And the orange sliver is the number of learning hours that happen in universities. And their forecast is we're going to double the number of learning hours on the age of 21, and that small sliver doesn't change at all. So while I agree with many of the conclusions in the report, I disagree with and fundamentally worry about what has led them to that conclusion. Because it is a sliver, that orange bit. Is somebody genuinely saying that as a nation we have to reskill ourselves, we have to relearn everything for a completely new economy, and that's not going to happen in universities? Really worrying. I hope it's going to be wrong. But I do have a belief that actually we probably need more skills. And I think that the skills are actually cross-organizational and, in your case, cross-faculty skills. So I offer you as an example one very short video. So this video is a soap dispenser. How could you possibly go wrong building a soap dispenser? So, an electrical engineer somewhere created a soap dispenser that will only dispense onto white hands. This soap dispenser is on sale in Africa. This was actually filmed in, I think, Joburg. What is fascinating is you think about the conversations about technology and the need for new skills, and then you realize, well, it'll just mean that we'll fail faster. So what do we actually need? Well, we need diversity in the workforce, because I'm guessing that when that product was being built, there was nobody black involved in the production of it. Otherwise, they'd have spotted it a little bit earlier, wouldn't they? But that's a really simple example. And imagine the really complex stuff we're doing with data and all the artificial intelligence. You know, to really screw things up fast requires a computer and somebody that understands AI and doesn't understand humans. So we're doing a lot of work around the ethics of artificial intelligence and the application of data-led decision-making and how you might imply some of those things. We've got organizations over in the US that have, for example, collected all the data on teachers' performance and then automatically generated the letters out to the teachers that it was going to sack with no human intervention. It's shocking what is being done. So when I say we need new skills, those skills aren't just about technology skills. So for example, we have this thing called the professional program. It's really designed at your students or people that are reskillers during the economy. People that understand that, for example, big data or data scientists are places where there are going to be lots of jobs and reasonably well-paid jobs. So it's about them being able to switch careers and learn all the skills that they need as they do that. And in the top 3, the data, in fact, in all of those ones actually, there's an ethics course, just like the one we were looking at earlier on the screen in that Teams example. So you cannot, in our view, become any of these things without understanding ethics, understanding privacy law, understanding things that aren't technology-based, but are critically important to their future. And so when we look at that aspect of how do you learn new skills, you've got to include all of those things. It's not just about a core competency in a particular area. And that's part of the reskilling journey. You know, I spend a lot of time showing people how AI works underneath the covers before I show them the subtitling bit in PowerPoint. Because if they understand how it works underneath the covers, they're going to be able to make a better judgment about when and when not to use technology. And for me, that learning journey continues all the way. So these are the certifications that I've done in the last 18 months. My latest 2 were the 2 that I achieved on Friday afternoon. Pretty stressful, under exam conditions, being tested on PowerPoint and Excel. It's a bit like doing your driving test. You learn how to drive to pass your test, and then you really learn how to drive. Well, it turns out I'd done 30 years of really using PowerPoint, not knowing how to do things properly. So I learned a lot in the exam. And this one down here, which was a huge chunk of time for me, around change management, because most IT projects underperform not because of the technology bit. They underperform because we don't do the people change bit. And I think a lot of what we've been talking about has been the people change things. And proudly, I did get my ethics and law in data and analytics certification as well. But what is interesting about this is that this isn't a university course. This is my self-curated course of learning I needed at the time. That bit about 2/3 of the information is going to be out of date by the time students leave, well, that's true. So I need, in fact, the data science and machine learning course, that one there, almost everything I learned in that course 18 months ago is already out of date. Because we've just released a new piece of technology that means I don't need to understand the data science anymore, I just need to know my source data. And so on Sunday night, I ran an experiment in the new service that would have taken me 4 weeks in the old service and required a lot of technical knowledge. So the knowledge is going out of date. There's some fundamentals that I need to have. But more than anything, I just need to keep recertifying. I need to keep relearning things. Actually, I don't care so much about the certificates. I care about acquiring the knowledge at the time I'm ready to use it. So if you go back to that chart about where learning is going to happen and assume that universities aren't part of that journey, I think the assumption that's coming out of that is the old model of universities. The old model of suspend everything while you take a 3-year course or a 4-year course is what people's assumptions are. So when I think about all the conversations that have happened in this room around the use of Teams, for example, and why do students like it? Because it's a more natural interface, it lines up with their world, they don't have to go into a big corporate systems. That's going to be multiplied 10 times when you think about adult learners who need short courses, who are going to be participating when they're working. So we don't have time to do the other 2 lines, but if I can leave you with some thoughts, the thing I think we're learning is agility is everything. But now it's easy to experiment. What's the worst that can happen when you experiment? Well, it sounds like from some of the stories today, the worst that can happen is that you have to go and add a welcome video to your LMS. We have to change the culture to become learn-it-alls, inside as well as outside. We certainly have to change the country. And often you only see the end of the story. You know, like with David, we heard the end of David's story. We didn't see his journey of 2 years to get there. We just looked and thought, oh, that's great. We just need to be there. But actually the journey is about learning as well. And so let me share with you a little bit more about our little robot. Think about the journey here. So that's what we saw, a little bit of trepidation. But what happened before then? A little bit unsteady on his feet. What happened before then? Ah. Now, if you were in a culture that didn't accept failure, you'd have stopped there, and you would never have got to that end stage. So if there's one thing to draw hope from is when people come and talk to you about the successes they've had, they don't necessarily share the 452 failures before they got there. But think about that, because your journey has to include how do you learn along the way, how do you learn from your mistakes, and how do you get the environment you need around you to be able to do that? And the answer is, put your welcome video in the LMS and then go somewhere else. Or whatever it might be to service the needs of the students that you're serving. Because there is no one answer, there's no right answer. Even David's answer isn't the right answer. David's answer is the right answer for David. But your students, your environment, your skills are different. So think about that learning journey that you're going to have to undertake as you go through this as well. And the good news is, there's lots of projected growth in lots of different professions. In all of these areas, there's growth. And the great news is, in all of these areas, the skills that are needed are changing. And that's where the opportunity sits, in all of those areas. And it's probably not something that's going to be tied into individual faculties going forward. Now, I've provided some references to some of the things I've talked about, some reading materials. I will put a copy of these slides up. I couldn't put it up in advance, as I heard earlier, because I didn't know what we were going to be talking about, because you picked the subjects. But I'll put a copy of the slides up onto that link as well. So we've got a couple of minutes for questions. The work done by Carol Dweck in that area is all about students achieving their potential. What is really interesting is that we've realized that actually it became a big blocker to us as an organization. And I still have areas where I'm not willing to go. There are some things I fear more than death. Kind of embarrassment and failure, I probably fear more than death. And so I've had to kind of adjust my mindset, and it's been really interesting, seeing me changing, but also seeing my colleagues change, but also the language and the conversations around that. Because, future skill absolutely is learning to learn, because you're not going to graduate with the information you need on day 1 in the job, and day 7 in the job, and day 365. So, that growth mindset has to help with coping with the change that we're going to be going through. And probably the best example of fixed mindset we have in our organization is people going, we tried that before, it didn't work. Because it didn't work last week, it might work this week. Yeah, so so our partner in that is Pearson, which is the world's largest education company. And so they are the ones that are creating the materials, they're doing the things like the filming of the patients and stuff like that in order to be able to produce it as a product. So what we're doing is we'll build the technology platform, and then we'll partner with somebody in that area, because I don't think it's sustainable for individual universities or small consortia of universities to be able to create things. So what we're looking for are, what are the examples that allow people to productize a solution rather than it being created by every individual institution, because it's hugely expensive creating those kind of resources. Even just getting the actors into a 3D lab is hugely expensive. So I would say, what's the organizations rather than what's the technology? What's the organizations that are building solutions like Pearson? And there's a lot happening in the military space, obviously. There's a lot happening in the mining space. And there's a lot happening in OH&S. And those solutions might well become relevant to universities as well as they're developed.
Right?
Okay, thank you.